What has Christian theology got to do with mental health and mental illness? One way of answering this question is to look at the ways in which different interpretations of mental illness influence people's experiences of it. This is not only true of religious interpretations, but also of other ones, including the more dominant medical interpretations of these experiences. A term such as mental illness locates experiences historically responded to in non-medical ways firmly within the medical domain, hints that the experience is both similar, because an illness, and dissimilar, because mental, to experiences such as flu, and suggests that the problems might be solved or helped by medical means. Being diagnosed as mentally ill is a relief for some people because it means that the way they were feeling and behaving is not a part of who they really are. For others, a medical diagnosis is more difficult, partly because some medical diagnoses attract stigma, and partly because medical diagnoses can present people as passive victims, not agents, and in the case of some diagnoses, diminish hope in the possibility of recovery. Some religious interpretations of mental illness adopt a medical model, while adding religious elements to supplement it in various ways. We will come on to these later. Others reject a medical interpretation and present a stark alternative to it. One of the anti-medical interpretations found in some Christian communities is that experiences such as depression and schizophrenia are the result of a sinful lifestyle or attitude towards the world. In part, this is because Christians regard joy as one of the fruits of the Spirit or results of Christian faith, and so experiences such as depression are seen as indicative of some kind of failure to live a full Christian life. As one Christian who has been on the receiving end of this kind of interpretation puts it, when dealing with people in the church, some see mental illness as a weakness, a sign that you don't have enough faith. They say it's a problem of the heart, you need to straighten things out with God. They make depression out to be a sin because you don't have the joy in your life that a Christian is supposed to have. This captures something of what motivates sin views. If joy and peace are among the fruits of the Spirit, people ask, then what are we to make of situations where people don't feel joy and peace? Sin views of mental illness tend to be extremely voluntaristic. They presuppose that people have a high degree of free will and choice with respect to attitudes, emotions, beliefs, as well as behaviour. A necessary condition of sin on this account is that people are able to do and be otherwise. The person chooses to sin, and by extension, they choose to be depressed. For example, in their Christian self-help book, Happiness is a Choice, The Symptoms, Causes and Cures of Depression, psychiatrists Frank Minerth and Paul Meyer write that happiness and, conversely, depression are choices, or perhaps more accurately, a series of choice, and that, as they put it, by applying the contents of this book, depression is 100% curable. Indeed, happiness is a choice. The role of free will and choice is sometimes articulated, but less explicitly, as in psychology professor E. Ray Harcum's 2010 book, God's Prescription for Mental Health and Religion, Smile if you truly believe your religion. According to Harcum, the highway to mental health is God's prescription of selfless devotion to others. The converse conclusion, that depressed people are selfish in a morally reprehensible way, becomes evident in the preface. Harcum writes, "A respected social worker once said to me about a mutual friend, if she would only start thinking about others instead of herself all the time, she would not have so many physical and psychological problems." Indeed, this one brief proposition summarises the central lesson of this book. God's prescription, the highway to mental health of individuals and of society, is the highway, God's way, which includes selfless devotion and service to others. On most sin accounts, depression never, or at least only infrequently, has a biological basis. One church website advises people that the notion of mental illness is a myth. There is usually nothing wrong with your body or your brain. You are suffering the consequences of sin in your life. You do indeed feel sick, but you would get better if you repent and change your lifestyle. Characteristic of self-help books, Manerth and Meyer provide a get-out clause, in this case by conceding that in some cases depression has a biological basis. However, they think that biological causes are far rarer than they are usually believed to be, and that most people use the idea that their depression has a biological basis as an excuse to avoid, quote, facing up to their own behavioural and emotional irresponsibilities as the cause of their depression. That's a direct quotation. Sin accounts of depression and their secular correlates may be popular partly because we want the universe to be just. For example, this person is suffering because they have done something wrong. And relatedly, because we want to find ways to reassure ourselves that we won't suffer similarly. For example, I'm not like that, so I won't get depression. Con Drury, a Christian who was a student of the philosopher Wittgenstein's and himself a philosopher and psychiatrist in a mental hospital in Dublin, wrote of the way in which sin, including absence of faith accounts, are used to deceive ourselves about our vulnerability to have mental illness. He writes that we, you and I, might one day be admitted to a mental hospital in a state of despairing melancholia or foolish mania, might become deluded or hallucinated. That is a thought not easily to be entertained. We like to think that either our intelligence or our willpower or our piety would save us from such a fate. I heard a sermon some time ago in which the preacher stated that the great increase in mental illness at the present time was due to the decay of faith. Anyone, he said, who had a firm belief in God would never suffer from nerves or a mental breakdown. Alas. So I think that's a really great quotation because it brings out what motivates sin accounts often. We like to think that our intelligence or our willpower or our piety would save us from such a fate. But I think the other thing that he really brings out here is the alas, because as a psychiatrist, he knows that this simply isn't true, that willpower and intelligence and piety don't always save people from such a fate. In addition to this, sin accounts are also popular because they chime with our folk wisdom about everyday emotions and how to manage them. When we feel down, it often does help to go and see friends, to do exercise, to go outside, to do something for others, and more generally to shake ourselves from the slough of despond. So our everyday experiences of low mood, for example, get generalised in sin accounts. And of course, well-regarded therapies such as behavioural therapies can work precisely because changing our behaviours and thoughts sometimes can change our mental states, including improving those associated with depression. So I think one reason sin interpretations have taken such a hold is that there's this sort of small kernel of truth in them, but this gets generalised far beyond what that kernel of truth, in fact, covers. In defence of sin interpretations, and I'm not going to be defending sin interpretations for very long, some proponents have argued that whether or not the kind of extreme voluntarism, the kind of extreme view of free will that we find in them is true to human nature, it is nevertheless helpful because it empowers people to see themselves as agents and it adds hope. For example, endorsing a sin account of mental illness, one person says, "The medical model destroys hope. Discouragement and despair permeate the concept of mental illness. So to inform a Christian client in an early interview, your problem basically seems to be the result of sin, does not discourage them, but rather gives them hope. Christians know that sin and its effects can be dealt with because God has said so in the scripture, and Christ died to overcome sin. So when sin is mentioned, there is real hope," according to this person. However, I think this conclusion should be resisted for two reasons. First, while voluntarism might be empowering in some respects, those strengths are outweighed by the fact that voluntarism induces feelings of guilt and blame in people already vulnerable to those things. Feelings of guilt and worthlessness and low self-esteem are already characteristic of depression and implicated in a number of other mental illnesses. And increasing them is likely to make the person's depression worse. Second, other theologies and therapies also have these kind of hopeful elements to do with recovery and so on, but do not come with the associated guilt and blame. We therefore have reason to prefer those theologies and therapies over ones that say depression is a choice and the result of sin. Let's turn to the first of these reasons for resisting the conclusion that sin interpretations are hopeful. As psychiatrist and philosopher Thomas Fuchs has shown, while severe depression is often characterised by the loss of the feelings and emotions, certain feelings such as guilt, anxiety, and worthlessness remain. Such feelings alienate rather than connect us to others. These feelings don't occur as one-off emotions with particular objects, but are embedded in the depressed mood so that they're directed both arbitrarily and at everything. Feelings of worthlessness or excessive or inappropriate guilt are among the 9 symptoms of major depressive order in psychiatric manuals. For example, DSM-5, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders that psychiatrists use to diagnose people, explains that the sense of worthlessness or guilt associated with a major depressive episode may include unrealistic negative evaluations of one's worth or guilty preoccupations or ruminations over past failings. Such individuals often misinterpret neutral or trivial day-to-day events as evidence of personal defects and have an exaggerated sense of responsibility for untoward events. In depression, it is often a non-specific feeling of guiltiness that comes first, and which is the catalyst for the person seeking a reason, such as a wrong they have committed. As one person puts it, it comes from below, from the gut, like a terrible oppression rising to the chest. Then a pressure arises like a crime that I have committed. I feel it like a wound in my chest that is my tortured conscience. Then this attracts my memories, and I have to think again of all that I have missed or done wrong in my life. According to DSM-5, the feelings of guiltiness may be delusional. In other words, they may be fixed beliefs that are not amenable to change in the light of conflicting evidence. In normal, non-depressed experience, we share a sense of reality with others that allows us, among other things, to take on the perspective of others in relation to ourselves. In normal, non-depressed experience, we don't think about the shared sense of reality very much because it's in the background of and the basis of our lived experience. It's part of the bedrock of unquestioned certainties. In delusional depression, in contrast, we can lose this interpersonal sense of reality, giving rise to feelings of alienation and distance from others. In the case of depressive delusion, as Fuchs argues, this makes it impossible to take others' perspectives and to gain distance from oneself, thus forcing the patient to completely equate themselves with their current depressed state. This is significant for inappropriate feelings of and delusions of guilt. As Fuchs puts it, drawing on examples of psychiatric cases, the delusional patient is identified with his existential feeling of guilt to the extent that he is guilty as such. There is no remorse, recompense, or forgiveness for the guilt that is not embedded in a common sphere that would allow for that. A state of self beyond the present one becomes unimaginable. It has always been like this, and it will stay like this forever. To remember or hope for anything different is deception. That's how it feels for many people when they're depressed. The person with depression characteristically will already be feeling guilt and worthlessness. Furthermore, these feelings of guilt and worthlessness are frequently inappropriate and delusional or recalcitrant in the face of evidence. The feeling of guiltiness can occur prior to any evaluation that one is guilty of something, and the feeling of guiltiness can then lead the person to seek an object or a reason for their sense of guilt. Actively increasing a person's feeling of guilt and worthlessness by holding them responsible for being depressed can have a terrible effect on them. This is shown in one person's account, and I could draw on many accounts that I've read and encountered here, but I'll stick with one person's account in his experience of attending 2 churches in Edinburgh. This person writes, "After moving house and changing church to a Baptist church, the new minister's preaching was very much of the 'you must try harder' variety, which made me feel really guilty, as I was already running at full capacity, just trying to function as a human being. He had only one sermon regardless of the text, which was, 'Look at what God has done for you, so how much more are you going to do in return?' Sad to say, if I had stayed away from that church, I would have got better quicker. After withdrawing from church, my condition did improve a lot, and I made good recovery, followed by a few years of very good health when I was not attending any church. Then another bout of depression set in with quite serious self-harm. By this stage, I had started going back to church and had chosen the nearest church to my house. Goodness knows why I was going there. I suppose I went because they were very welcoming. But they had a very clear expectation that the normal Christian life was one of very fast transformation within 6 months or so of attending. Anything else was a sign of something being wrong with your spiritual life, or the result of hidden sin. It was a guaranteed recipe for disaster with regards to my mental health." Conversely, release from sin accounts of depression is often experienced as therapeutic. For example, the Quaker author and activist Parker Palmer relates the case of a woman with depression who asks him why he thinks some people with depression die through suicide while others become better. At the time, Parker racked his brain for a good answer, but eventually confessed, "I have no idea. I really have no idea." In the days that followed, Palmer was haunted by the regret that he hadn't been able to come up with anything more helpful. However, when the woman contacted him again, she said that, of all the things in their conversation, it was "I have no idea" that stayed with her the most. Palmer writes, "My response had given her an alternative to the cruel Christian explanations common in the church to which he belonged, that people who take their own lives lack faith or good works or some other redeeming virtue that might move God to rescue them. My not knowing had freed her to stop judging herself for being depressed and to stop believing that God was judging her. As a result, her depression had lifted a bit." Voluntarists who connect depression with sin argue that agreeing with someone that they had limited agency is only going to worsen their depression. In contrast to this, they say voluntarism provides a form of support and encouragement to act, especially to act in ways that are conducive to recovering from depression. But, as the accounts I've just read show, being told that depression is the result of sin or spiritual failure is likely to worsen rather than help people with depression. This is particularly the case because of the role of guilt and blame in voluntarism, which confirms the feelings of guiltiness and worthlessness already characteristic of depression. In addition to this, there are other theologies and therapies that provide a sense of hope at least as powerful as those given in voluntaristic accounts of depression, but that do so without the accompanying sense of guilt or blame. One example of such a therapy is behavioural therapy, when this is practised well. This tends to give analogous practical advice to people about behaviours that are conducive to good mental health. See friends, do exercise when you can, but without attaching blame to people who can't follow it through. One example of a hopeful theology is a potentially transformative view, which points to the ways in which some people have found that God brings good out of evil, including the evil of suffering involved in experiences of mental illness. I will consider a potentially transformative account in a few minutes. It's enough for now to note that sin accounts of depression don't have a monopoly on providing hope. There are other accounts of depression than voluntarism which provide hope without increasing a person's sense of guilt or worthlessness. Sin accounts of depression can also be damaging in less direct ways. For example, they can discourage someone from seeking medical and psychological help that may be therapeutic or even life-saving. That sin accounts of mental illness can function in this way, and the way they interact with other societal pressures, becomes clear in relation to the following account involving someone who suffers from bipolar disorder. A few months ago, an acquaintance told me about her mother-in-law, Cynthia, who had been found to have bipolar disorder in her late 50s. Always having been a competent person, Cynthia had a great deal of trouble coming to terms with this. She refused to accept the diagnosis or to take the medications prescribed by her doctor. She was hospitalised several times. Failing to cope, her life and her family's life was in turmoil. The evangelical faith she followed did not encourage her in her battle. The general opinion she had grown up with was that emotional problems were an indication of not being right with God, the result of sin. In her minds and the minds of many others in her church, her illness was not a medical issue. They believed, as one author wrote, if a person has the peace of God which passeth all understanding in his life, he cannot have emotional conflict. Ultimately, symptoms are spiritual problems, according to that person. Cynthia's friend from church told her that taking medications demonstrated a lack of faith. The friend advised her to throw away her pills. Not long after, Cynthia was found wandering the streets of another city, confused and in a daze. She had to be committed to a hospital against her will. To this day, she is still in denial, feeling guilt and shame. While sin views seek to provide a helpful alternative to the view that mental illness is a disease and the person a passive victim to it, they are in fact deeply problematic because they exacerbate negative feelings such as guilt that are often already an aspect of the person's psychological problems, and also because they encourage blame, avoidance and judgment on the part of church congregations who might otherwise provide support and so increase the alienation of the person who is suffering. In addition to all of this, they're problematic in another way. Because they focus on the alleged sinfulness of the person who is mentally ill, they deflect attention away from the social causes of mental illness, which include poverty, discrimination, displacement, and so on. To put the matter in theological terms, these sin interpretations focus on individual or personal sin to the exclusion of social sin. That is, sin that resides in societies and structures that perpetuate injustice. In so doing, they are victim-blaming. People who are more likely to experience mental illness precisely because they are members of marginalised groups are also more likely to be blamed for their mental illness by proponents of sin interpretations. It is no accident that studies have found that women and gay people, for example, are much more likely to be told that their mental illness is the result of their sin or a lack of faith than are heterosexual men. I mentioned earlier that while some Christian interpretations reject medical accounts of mental illness in favour of a religious or apparently religious account such as sin, others adopt a medical, for example a biopsychosocial model of mental illness, but supplement it with Christian themes in some ways. These interpretations are both and accounts because, unlike the sin interpretation, they hold that something might be both a mental illness and also a religious experience, or experience through which someone might encounter God. One example of this is what I call the potentially transformative interpretation of mental illness. According to a potentially transformative interpretation, mental distress is in itself undesirable, but it is nevertheless the case that through it people can grow in some way, or, in theological terms, that God can bring good out of evil. The potentially bit is important, since this view does not claim that growth always happens, or that there is something automatic about it. It only claims that growth or transformation is a possibility. While sin accounts are often found in self-help books, potentially transformative accounts are found more often in autobiographies involving mental illness. Consider, for example, the following account of someone looking back on an experience of depression from which they have recovered. It was certainly a time of purification for me. My heart, ever questioning my goodness, value and worth, has become anchored in deeper love and thus less dependent on the praise and blame of those around me. It has also grown into a greater ability to give love without always expecting love in return. What once seemed a curse has become a blessing. All the agony that threatened to destroy my life now seems like fertile ground for greater trust, stronger hope, and deeper love. These are the words of Henri Nervin, a psychologist and Roman Catholic priest, looking back on the diary he kept during a major depressive episode he experienced between 1987 and 1988. Not all potentially transformative accounts are by Christians. For example, Andrew Solomon writes that if you yourself have been depressed, you lose some of your fear of crisis and are more likely to help others who have depression. He goes on to say, if you have been through such a thing, you cannot watch it unfold in the life of someone else without feeling horrified. It is easier for me in many ways to plunge myself into the sorrow of others than it is for me to watch the sorrow and stay out of it. Not interfering is like watching someone spilling good wine all over the dinner table. It is easier to turn the bottle upright and wipe up the puddle than it is to ignore what is going on. Some people talk about the way in which depression has, after the event, given them a heightened appreciation of beauty, and especially the beauty of the natural world. For example, one person writes that following the sudden death of her husband, the shock and deep depression took some years to live through, but gradually my mind became more conscious of a more acute sense of the beauties that are around us and a thankfulness which I was not aware of before. As this suggests, people understand their experience of depression to have been transformative in different ways, perhaps because it provides them with insight that makes them happier with themselves and better at relating to others, as in the case of Nervin, or perhaps because it makes us more compassionate and courageous, as in the case of Solomon, or perhaps because it makes people more able to experience beauty and give thanks for it, as in the final account that we looked at. The underlying theological idea of a potentially transformative view is that God brings good out of evil. Within the Christian tradition, this is well established. Julian of Norwich writes, "It is characteristic of God to overcome evil with good. Jesus Christ, therefore, who overcame evil with good, is our true mother." Here she is referring both to the idea of the Felix culpa, or happy accident, of Adam and Eve's fall from grace in the Garden of Eden, which gave rise to the Incarnation, the happy event, and also to the death and resurrection of Jesus. The Gospels tell a story of Jesus' torture and execution, a death that was considered politically expedient because Jesus' ministry of compassion disrupted the status quo. Yet out of the evil of Jesus' suffering and death came liberation and new life. Partly because they arise out of non-prescriptive autobiographies rather than self-help books, a potentially transformative view of depression can reflect people's real experiences. A further strength is that a potentially transformative view can facilitate good things coming out of evil, perhaps by making someone open to that possibility, and can provide people with a sense of meaning and hope and purpose while they are suffering. At the same time, some significant objections have been put forward against a potentially transformative view, and these are worth taking seriously since they highlight how a potentially transformative view can go wrong and indicate what we can do to avoid that. Here are the 3 objections I take to be the most serious. First, choice and blame. One worry with a potentially transformative account is that it can indicate that everyone who experiences mental illness has the capacity to grow or be transformed in the ways that we've talked about as a result of it. While a potentially transformative account seeks to be the opposite of a sin account, here we might worry that the sin account is sneaking in through the back door. As with sin accounts, here there is a real risk of pressure and a sense of blame if the person does not appear to have made the correct choice in how she responds to her suffering through transformation and growth and so on. Second, a potentially transformative view may also justify evil and encourage apathy in relation to political and social injustice, including the political and social injustices that are causally implicated in mental illness. Here the speaker would, in effect, be saying, don't be angry and try to change society. Instead, find some positive thing about the situation so that you can accept the situation lying down. If our primary response to depression, for example, is to point to ways in which it is or might be an opportunity for personal growth, we deflect our own and others' attention away from the social causes of depression, causes such as poverty, oppression, patriarchy, homophobia, racism, casualised contracts, and the instability that it gives rise to, unfulfilling work, poor living conditions, and so on. Even if we recognise these social causes in theory, we might cease to look them fully in the face and seek instead to find ways to resist them. Instead, we adopt the strategy of not trying to change our society, but instead we put the burden on individuals to change their attitude towards the problems they face. Third and finally, a potentially transformative view seems best suited to milder and shorter-term cases of mental illness, and it's notable that the cases I've looked at particularly relate to depression and to non-permanent depression. Therefore, it can be difficult to see how it applies to severe and permanent cases of mental illness, for example, more severe cases of depression, but perhaps also schizophrenia and so on. In Nervan's case, his depression lasted for under a year. The fact that it was fertile ground is due in part to the therapy he undertook as part of his recovery process. The therapy meant that he was not only cured or able to recover, he also experienced a deeper kind of healing that meant that in his post-depression state, he was happier than he had been in his pre-depression state. It would be simplistic to say that it was his recovery and the accompanying therapy rather than depression per se that proved to be fertile ground. It was these things in combination. And yet the example of Nervan raises the question of what a potentially transformative view has to offer to someone whose mental illness is both too severe for the kind of psychological exploration Nervan's therapy involved, and also long-term or permanent, so that there is no recovered state from which the person can reflect on the experience of depression with hindsight. This is a serious objection, since a Christian response to mental illness, or indeed to any other kind of suffering, needs to speak to all experiences of suffering, and not only mild or moderate or shorter-term cases of suffering. A potentially transformative view of depression is not adequate if it comforts people who suffer mild or moderate amounts of suffering, but has nothing to say to people who experience suffering most severely. Let me try to respond to these objections and see what a potentially transformative view has to be like if it is to avoid these sorts of problems. First, regarding choice and blame, I suggest that the medium is important to the message here. Potentially transformative accounts, as I've pointed out, are at their best when they are autobiographical and descriptive of the person's own experience. When they become prescriptive, they are, like sin interpretations, problematic. Transformation may have been possible for Nervan, but it might not be possible for everyone, at least in the present life. A potentially transformative view need not and should not be voluntaristic. It needs not and should not say that people always have a choice about whether to respond to depression or another kind of suffering in a positive or fruitful sort of way. Correspondingly, it need not and should not put pressure on people to find good things in distressing experiences, or to attribute blame to people who do not find their experience of suffering transformative in the way that Nervan and others seem to have done. And I think as well, while sin accounts tend to be quite Pelagian in their theology, partly because of this emphasis on free will and the capacity to choose how you respond to certain situations, a potentially transformative account should always have a robust understanding of divine grace. So it's never just about the person's choice and so on. It's always about something that God does in the life of the person. Second, regarding social and political apathy, The theological narrative that a potentially transformative account involves is that God brings good out of evil. This is important because it highlights that the suffering involved in mental illness is an evil, and we should hope people avoid it, and if they do suffer from it, we should hope for their recovery and seek a cure. By evil here, I simply mean that it's undesirable. I certainly don't mean that the person themselves is evil. Provided that we remember that suffering is an evil, we shouldn't get so caught up in the possible benefits of depression that we forget it would be better if the person did not have depression in the first place. In reality, for those of us who have significant experience of depression, idealising the suffering involved in it is, I think, unlikely. Relatedly, we should not forget that our first priority is always to try to minimise or eradicate those social and political evils that are significant causes of depression, and to provide resources for healing of those who suffer from depression already. In fact, one of the ways in which suffering can be transformative is that it can lead to social and political action, and so away from apathy. The transformation that can take place isn't just an interior sort of personal or spiritual growth. It is something that is worked out in the world and in relation to others. This is true not only for the suffering involved in depression, but in relation to other kinds of suffering as well. For example, Rosa Parks' ongoing experience of racist oppression led to her resistance of bus segregation and her work in advancing workers' rights and racial equality. In the context of mental illness, Nervan's own experience of depression led him from quite a conservative stance on homosexuality, and he himself was gay, to him having a ministry for gay people with AIDS and HIV in the 1980s, and speaking out in favour of gay people in monogamous relationships. So again, his experience of depression seems to have given rise to some kind of action within a social and political sphere. A potentially transformative view of suffering only encourages apathy if the spirituality that accompanies it is individualistic and dualistic and concerned only with an alleged private interior life and not with the social and political aspects of the gospel. Now I will turn to the third objection, that a potentially transformative view applies only to less severe and non-permanent cases of mental illness. There are some possible exceptions to this. For example, David Karp talks about how his realisation that his depression is almost certainly permanent has caused him to move beyond a simply problem-solving approach to mental illness to a transformative and spiritual one. He writes, "The recognition that the pain of depression is unlikely to disappear has provoked a redefinition of its meaning and reordering of its place in my life. It has taken me more than 2 decades to abandon the medical language of cure in favour of a more spiritual vocabulary of transformation." Nevertheless, the objection seems broadly correct. In the case of Nervan, for example, it seems likely from his writings that the transformation was made possible not just by the experience of depression, but also by his recovery process and the therapy that took place as a result of that. Here a Christian response might point beyond the present life to future hope. For Christians, the resurrection of Christ isn't just something that happened to Jesus. It's the basis of Christian hope for the future transformation of the world and for the lives of people and other creatures within it. In the present life, we might see in a mirror dimly how even experiences such as depression can be transformative. However, in this life, it is only a partial reflection of what we hope for at the SCRUTTON. How is understanding different religious and other spiritual interpretations of mental illness practically relevant? One way is that medical professionals, if they understand people's religious beliefs about mental illness, are in a better position to provide good care and treatment of them. As psychiatrist Harold Koenig puts it, knowing the impact that religious beliefs may have on the etiology, diagnosis and outcome of psychiatric disorders will help psychiatrists better understand their patients, appreciate when religious or spiritual beliefs are used to cope with mental illness and when they may be exacerbating that illness. A medical professional who understands religious belief is in a better position to discern when a person's beliefs are contributing to their mental distress by making them feel guilty about having a mental illness or some other aspect of their life, or, on the other hand, when clinicians should work with the person's religious community because a religious interpretation is likely to provide a more meaningful understanding of their experience than a purely medical understanding could do alone. Understanding different religious interpretations of mental illness is also important for religious communities, and especially for people with pastoral roles, whether formal or informal. People with pastoral roles in churches, for example, are often the first port of call for people experiencing mental health challenges. People may be met with judgment and blame and may be discouraged from seeking medical support at a crucial early stage. On the other hand, they may be met with acceptance and understanding and appropriate signposting to medical health services. In each case, the response they receive will have a profound, though very different, effect on them.